Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's session on the planning proposal process. My name is Marcelo Occhuzzi. I'm the Manager of Strategic Planning here at North Sydney Council.
My name is Neil McCarry. I'm a team leader in strategic planning also.
Before we begin tonight's proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the place that Neil and I sit on, at least, the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and may we care for this land as they did before us. Today's session has been prepared for the precinct office bearers and precinct committee members. There's one or two others that no doubt will have joined in as well. So this is in response to the precinct, the joint precinct committee and the precinct committees generally, and their desire to gain a little more understanding in this space, which can be a little complicated. Before we go too much further, just a little bit of housekeeping. Before we get started, the session will run for around about an hour or so. I think it will probably go a little bit longer, which is fine from our perspective. If you need to be elsewhere, by all means. Neil and I will keep it as brief as possible without losing too much content. So we think we'll go for around about 40 minutes. But as I say, we'll try and move through things reasonably quickly. After the presentation, we'll go through, there was some pre-submitted questions and queries. We'll go through systematically through those, although I think we will address the majority of those through the presentation. And we also encourage you to raise issues or questions in the chat function if you have anything that's burning on your mind, you'd like to get off your chest, and we'll try and come back to those. Now you'll note that all of your mics have been muted. It will be a fairly noisy affair otherwise, but we will, if we have time at the end, sort of open it up to open dialogue, questions if there are any. And as you heard right up front there, if you were with us at the beginning, this is being recorded and it will be placed on our website. One little word of warning: Neil and I are planners, we're not Zoom experts. So, you know, if things get a bit funky through this, you know, I'll blame it on that.
Okay, well, I'm just trying to share the screen now. So give me a moment. And hopefully you can all see that slide there. Someone want to give me a thumbs up? That looks like it's working. That's a good start. Thank you. Okay.
All right. So I'll just have to click on that again. Just to, okay, thank you. So what we'll cover tonight, obviously, what is a planning proposal? We will try and distinguish for you the difference between local environment plans and development control plans. You know, many of you will be aware of that, but just we'll move through that very quickly. The difference between planning proposals and development applications, which is sometimes a point of contention amongst folk. We'll talk through the planning proposal process, the role of panels. There is a variety of panels in operation in New South Wales. We'll cover off on what the local strategic planning statement is, the LSPS, often referred to as, and its role in the assessment of planning proposals. And we'll try and illustrate some of that stuff through a couple of case studies, fairly recent case studies that some of you may be aware of. So first and foremost, a planning proposal is an application basically to amend the controls in the local environmental plan. The local environmental plan, the LEP, establishes land use zones and what's permissible in each of the zones. It sets things like height limits, floor space ratios. It identifies what's heritage and a range of other matters for assessment of a development application. The LEP is split between the written document, it's a legal document, and the maps. So there's just a couple of examples there. The zoning map there on the top right-hand corner identifies your residential zones, open space zones, environmental protection zones, and so The height map identifies for every parcel what height is applicable to that particular site, and the heritage map, in this case, identified in pink, is the heritage conservation areas, and then in individual browns, the heritage sites. So they're very high level overview of what the basics of an LEP include. I want to click on the okay, so there's the LEP and then the development control plan. So how do each relate to the other? So firstly, all development that requires consent, not all development requires consent. For example, there's a sliding scale of development types. At one end, you've got letterboxes, antennas, pergolas, that sort of thing. They're exempt development. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got state significant development, arterial roads and railways and mines and things like that. What we're talking about is we won't get into a huge amount of detail here, but the sort of development that occurs in the middle. When development consent is required, you've got to go through that LEP and DCP assessment process, a consideration of what's in each. The LEP has more statutory strength. It goes through a much more onerous process, creation and then amendment. It establishes permissibility and prohibition that the DCP can't do. So it can dictate straight out of the blocks there in the zoning regime that certain types of things are simply not able to happen in certain areas. It establishes standards, as I said, height is an example, and that whilst they're variable, that they've got to pass certain predetermined tests. And an amendment to the LEP or the creation of an LEP has to be determined and approved by other bodies, particularly the Department of Planning. It is also guided by a standard template, which was introduced more than 15 years ago now. In the past, councils could create their own local environmental plans determined and influenced by local conditions. These days, it's a much tighter level of control that the state government has over the look and feel and content of those LEPs. The DCP, on the other hand, it's a very thick document. If you've ever picked it up, it probably weighs 1 kilogram. I'm not joking. It's a design-based document. It includes much more detailed things like setbacks, privacy, landscaping, solar access, and a whole range of other design-based controls. Council pretty much has free rein in terms of its content. However, a very important principle enshrined in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act is that a set of DCP controls can't undermine the achievement of what the LEP seeks to do. So the LEP, for example, might have a height limit of 8.5 metres or 2 stories. The DCP can't conspire with other controls to work against the realisation of that. And that's a really important principle because some folk are keen to include all sorts of things in the DCP, but there are limits in terms of its relationship to the LEP. Again, just another distinction before we move on to the actual process. Planning proposals and development applications, they're sometimes confused. They're very, very different processes and beasts. So as I said before, and I'll say it again, planning proposal is an application to amend the controls in the local environmental plan. When we are tested in the City North Planning Panel, if the councils refuse the planning proposal, that panel looks at strategic merit and site-specific merit. The other thing to note in a planning proposal, which can be a little bit of a misnomer, is there are sometimes very, very detailed plans that are lodged in planning proposals. We call them proof of concept, and they have very little status apart from really trying to illustrate what it is that they're trying to seek amendment on. Other than that, so for example, if an application to vary the height limit, there might be a beautifully rendered 30-storey, 20-storey building designed and put forward as an example of how the controls might operate if amended. That design has no status apart from trying to illustrate a point. So that design, if ultimately the amendment is approved, be thrown in the garbage bin. It has zero status. Unlike a development application, a development application is a very specific, a very detailed proposal to actually do something, to actually build something, and it's assessed against and in response to the controls in the LEP and the DCP. So whilst the PP seeks to amend the LEP, the development application is simply an application that responds to the LEP and DCP and actually tries to build something. So this is a slightly convoluted diagram, just showing what is a typical planning proposal process. There's probably no such thing as a typical planning proposal process, but this tries to highlight what the important steps of the process are. So starting from the top, a planning proposal is lodged through the planning portal by a party. The council can lodge its own planning proposals to seek to amend some controls that it may deem desirable to pursue. As soon as that's lodged, we place that all the documentation associated with that planning proposal on our website, and many of you, no doubt, have found documents on that or sought documents on the council website in the DA tracker part of the website. When we receive a planning proposal, we also put a big blue notice out there on site to let people know what's going on. But the planning proposal isn't on public exhibition. We've simply received it and it is under assessment. Once the internal assessment is conducted, we prepare a report to the local planning panel. We notify anyone that's made a submission, and we often receive submissions, even though it's not formally on public exhibition. We notify people that the matter is being considered by the local planning panel. The local planning panel reviews the proposal, the council report, and simply recommends a course of action to the council. It does not make decisions. The local planning panel simply recommends a course of action. Within 2 weeks or so, that's referred then to the council, and then it does make a decision about whether, as those two arrows indicate, either to refuse the proposal or to endorse its passage through the rest of the process. Now, if the council resolves to refuse that particular proposal, that triggers the capacity or the opportunity of an applicant to lodge a rezoning review to challenge that refusal. If the council hasn't made a decision within 90 days, that's also a trigger for an applicant to lodge a rezoning review. We call that a deemed refusal. That's not the real term for it, but that's the terminology that's used with development applications. So we may find ourselves in the Sydney North Planning Panel, a different body, making a decision where council either hasn't made a decision in 90 days or it's refused the application. So the Sydney North Planning Panel, if it considers a planning proposal and recommends refusal, that's the end of the line. If a refusal is considered by the Sydney North Planning Panel and endorsed by that panel, or the council endorses the planning proposal, then we're off to the right-hand side of the page there, and the Department of Planning is asked to issue a gateway determination. A gateway determination is basically the green light, the permission to achieve public exhibition. We can't formally place the planning proposal on public exhibition without the approval of the Department of Planning. So we're in their hands. The gateway determination is not often, always includes conditions about who to consult with, how long the process should take, whether additional studies should be undertaken, etc. The general requirement is a 28-day exhibition, although council more recently has been exhibiting planning proposals for 42 days to give people an extra bit of time. Once that exhibition period is finished, the council receives submissions and another report is prepared for council, and it's either refused or approved at that point, and then sent off to the Department of Planning for gazette, or if it's refused, we notify the department. Now, there's a little note there on you'll have to tilt your head to read it, but it's in inverted commas, the PPA role. Since December of 2021, with some new guidelines were prepared by the Department of Planning. Any planning proposal that's been refused by the council, there triggers the PPA role, which is essentially an administrative role to be conducted by others, not North Sydney Council. Normally, it's the Sydney North Planning Panel to undertake everything on the right-hand side of that page. So the exhibition, the compilation of submissions that are received, the assessment of those submissions, and the final recommendation. That's the table, and we'll refer back to this table just to illustrate real examples to come and enliven that for you a little bit. I think I've spoken about this. I won't spend too long on the role of panels. We do have within North Sydney Council the Design Excellence Panel. That's generally used for development applications, but it is on occasion used to provide design advice for planning proposals. And bearing in mind what I said about the actual design of buildings and proposals having very little status. The North Sydney Local Planning Panel, again, it's a panel that mainly does its business in the development application space. It's probably 80 to 90% of its functions dedicated to that. But it is also a body that we are required to refer planning proposals to, and that is an open forum to applicants and submitters, and no doubt some of you have either addressed or attended those panels. Then the Sydney North Planning Panel is that sort of more regional panel that considers rezoning reviews. So where council has refused or not determined a planning proposal in 90 days. And that is a closed shop. And I know lots of folk have made submissions and expressed frustration around that, but that continues to be the case. It's not an open hearing. Council staff attend on behalf of council and argue our case, but it's not open to the public. I've talked about the guidelines that were updated regarding the PPA role, and there were a couple of references to the Land and Environment Court. Land and Environment Court doesn't play a role in planning proposals. There was some talk last year about doing that, but that didn't get anywhere. So really, the Land and Environment Court is a space for development applications. The local strategic planning statement is an important document in the process. So section 3.9 of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act requires that all councils prepare an LSPS. So the LSPS is council's strategic vision for the future of North Sydney. It was assured or approved by the Greater Cities Commission now in March of 2020. It only seems like not that long ago, but there you go, more than 2 years ago. The Environmental Planning and Assessment Act actually requires that a planning proposal give effect to the council's LSPS. That's important because the document is sometimes not as thoroughly discussed in particularly the Sydney North Planning Panel, and we constantly having to table its contents to ensure that it is a matter for consideration. And the reason, or one of the key reasons why we do so is that there's a key component there, action, I think it's L1.5, that says council will only support planning proposals that are consistent with council's endorsed planning studies that do certain things. So we are proactive in pushing forward with a planning framework that's consultative and informed to guide change, to guide growth, because we do have under the regional plan for Sydney and the district plan for the north of Sydney, where we sit, we do have certain growth responsibilities, housing growth responsibilities, employment growth responsibilities, and this is the best way that we think we can manage that growth rather than allowing the market simply to have a go at managing that growth for us. So I think before we move on, I'll hand over to Neil in a moment. But before we do so, we might just see if we can catch up on some of those questions.
I'm happy to let myself get a drink of water. There's been 3 questions come through so far, so I'll have a go at these now, and then at the end of the session, we can talk further if that helps. First one is, can a DA be approved if it breaches the LEP, for example, height controls? The short answer is yes, but the magnitude or the variation it's called is a lot more modest nature. So, for example, if a site of a 2-story dwelling house had an 8.5 metre height limit, that height is measured and across the different points in the site, and let's say it's sloped some way. There's cases that people reasonably put forward, and there's quite a tight process that they have to satisfy, where rather than building with 5 or 6 different steps down it, they may seek to have two partial levels, and a portion of that may breach that height limit. So short answer is yes, but it's a lot tighter, a lot more scrutiny, and there's been various court tests which have been applied as well to help regulate that. The next question is it a gateway to what? That term gateway determination, sorry, I've just got someone joining us a bit late. That term gateway determination comes straight from the legislation. It was introduced in around 2009 or 10. It used to be called a section something point something certificate. So how they've come up with that, I'm not exactly sure, but I guess the inference is it's a gateway or a stopping point, whereby if something doesn't meet those strategic things that it stops. And then if that gateway determination is issued, as Marcelo said, it allows that formal public exhibition process to occur. There's another question that asks, what proportion approximately of refusals does North Sydney North Planning Panel then go on to endorse? Look, off the top of my head, I'm going to say it's more than half of them, since I've been here a little over 5 years and Marcelo longer than I. We have a table at the end with a bit of a snapshot of all the current planning proposals and their states. So that might help with that question, but I might, to give you some accuracy, might take that one and come back via email later or for the group. But yeah, of late in particular, more than half, or let's say the majority, unfortunately, have been subsequently progressed through that Sydney North Planning Panel.
I think if I could just jump in, we had, I think the last 5, of the last 5, 4 have not been supported by the Sydney North Planning Panel. We've only one. One of those
not supported.
Yeah, so we've borne the wrath of the Sydney North Planning Panel 4 of the last 5 times that we've gone there. So success rate hasn't been great of late.
But there's another comment just coming there on the challenges of growth and obviously the community's concern around that. I might just defer that one, if that's okay, to the end. But Marcelo was just explaining that framework there, where the Greater Cities Commission developed these metropolitan plans, and then North Sydney, this LSPS document is important. I was fairly heavily involved in it. North Sydney, and like all the councils in the district, had to prepare what I call this as our response, or how are we going to enact those higher order plans. And our frustration, to be candid about it, is that this doesn't seem to be given the weight that we feel it should through the planning proposal process. But if we have time, we'll come back to talk a bit more about some of those growth challenges. So I'm going to continue on now and just give you some background on and feeding from that question and comment. Thank you for that. I think it was Peter. So consistent with that action in the LSPS, Council seeks to guide and manage development pressure by preparing sort of consultative holistic planning studies. And this has been a fairly long established practice at North Sydney. And the benefits of that is you're getting that early community consultation and a better understanding of the values and challenges of an area, but you're also not then in a reactive position. If we were to do none of these studies and then you present or turn up at a Sydney North Planning Panel hearing and you just don't have a position on it from a local perspective, it's a lot weaker base, if that's the word, to help defend that decision. So just listed a few there that have occurred of late, some before my time, some while I've been here. So we had the first stage of St Leonard's and Crow's Nest. We had the precincts 2 and 3, and then we had just started, and I say just started, this is around 2016 or so, the Crow's Nest placemaking principle. So that was the first step. There's a couple of others listed there that I'll leave you to. Don't have to read them out now. So can you just click on the slide and then I can get control. So the reason I raised that St Leonard's Crow's Nest one and the timing of that is that piece of work was underway by council and was in place. So council's endorsed study, and then proponents were responding via planning proposals to the council endorsed position on those areas. And then the state government came in and declared portion of Willoughby Council, Lane Cove, as well as North Sydney, as what's called a priority precinct or a planned precinct, where effectively they took over that strategic planning function for that period of time. I could probably do a whole presentation on that process, but the key point here is that from between that time, the result outcome in August 2020 was the finalisation of the plan. And probably as importantly was that plan that when it was released was accompanied by a ministerial direction. So that's a section of the Act that allows the minister to give directions to local government that stated that council must ensure that a planning proposal is consistent with the St Leonard's Crow's Nest 2036 plan. So that's just a little bit about the strategic framework. And what I plan to do now is just to step through two examples of planning proposals and slightly different paths they took. And the main purpose is just to illustrate how they can run, the timeframes, the processes, the different decision points and issues that each elicits. So you don't have to get, you may know them already. So I'll dive into it. The first one is a site up in Atchison Street, 23 to 35 Atchison Street, St Leonard's. This was lodged importantly in 2018, so that was a stage where council had its endorsed study in place, but it was prior to the 2036 plan being adopted. And that proposal sought to amend the building height, so increasing from 20 metres to 56 metres, increase the non-residential floor space, so that's jobs, retail, commercial uses, floor space ratio there from 0.6 to 1.5 to 1. Apply a total maximum floor space ratio on the site, and also was a voluntary planning agreement associated with that. Just quickly, the concept of the floor space ratio, for those who may not be familiar, it's essentially a density provision. So it's expressed as a ratio. So for ease of maths, if I had a site that was 1,000 square metres in area and it had a floor space ratio of 6 to 1, that would give me a maximum total amount of floor space of 6,000 square metres that you could build on the site. So that could be built in a box all the way to the boundary for 6 stories in height, or it could be built over a tower, in this case over 16 stories. So we express things just quickly in metres in our LEP, but obviously that sometimes it's hard to translate, but for your benefit, that this site, the 56 metres was to facilitate a 16-storey building, so lower levels commercial and upper levels residential. So just so people can see what that looks like, this is a little extract of before and after. On the left of the screen is the old LEP height, so you see there they had a colour there and a key and a 20-metre height limit, and then on the right of screen you can see the area marked with Z. And when that was the amendment, the effect of that was to apply a 56-metre height limit to that site, as well as the other things I mentioned. So just to give you a feeling of the timeframes and how this may run. So this example was lodged in early 2018. It was assessed in some detail, and that the introduction of that concept plan is a good tool, as Marcella's point is well made, that it doesn't have a formal status. However, it allows us to test and really interrogate, can you achieve a reasonable built form and with some level of amenity, and what are the impacts? It enables you to test that rather than just responding to an ambit claim. So this proposal was assessed in that process and referred to the North Sydney Local Planning Panel. So just to repeat, they're an advisory function to council. So they give their opinion on it, and then that goes before council, in this instance, who supported the proposal. Went off to the Department of Planning, who issued the gateway determination several months later, and late 2018. There was a few conditions in that we had to meet, consulting with aviation authorities and the like, and there was an exhibition held in April, May 2019, and then that was re-referred, the outcome of that exhibition was re-referred back to council in September, 2019, and then the gazettal or the amendment came into force or happened in May 2020. So you're looking there, over 2.5 years from lodgement to an actual amendment occurring. So to translate that, if this helps, quickly back to our process here, I've just got here the steps as that I've read out there. So local planning panel comment, council endorsed it in this case, to the the department, gateway issued, exhibition occurred, back to council for a final decision on whether to proceed, and then the plan coming into effect. So in this occasion, in this example, the PPA role, so that's Principal Planning Authority, that means in simple terms that council ran the public exhibition, conducted a lot of the administration, map making and that sort of thing. And then ultimately, just to make it clear that we don't have the power to make that actual amendment to the LEP, it goes through a legal process and the Department of Planning. So in terms of the tail of this one, so we've got that amendment being made in May, and then this turned into an actual DA. So development application is the actual plans that they're seeking approval for. So that was approved in May of last year. And since that time, there's been 2 subsequent variations or amendments to those plans. So I display that graphic there to make the point that that's an extract. It's a rendered image, but an extract from the actual DA package. So you can see, I won't jump back now. You can see it does go through some amendment and refining for hopefully moving from that block model massings through to an actual building that has some more attributes, I suppose, positive attributes in terms of design elements and architectural materials, that sort of thing. So that now is what if you're adding up the process through to a DA. So there's no construction started on this site. So the process from go to woe, can be anything. This is around over 3.5, 4 years now. So by the time something may get built, can be several years later. So just to give a bit of context. So that's one example where, just to capture that, it was consistent with council's planning study, and it went through this process and led to that amendment, and we now have a DA approved. The next one may be familiar to some of you as well, was a site that was initially described or took in 173 to 179 Walker Street, North Sydney. It was lodged in October 2017. It was seeking a very dramatic height increase of around 140 metres and an FSR of 13.6 to 1 on that site. This was refused or rejected by council in February 2018, lodged a rezoning review, which was heard in April 2018, and that was not supported by that panel. However, in giving their recommendation or findings, they did give some direction as to what they thought may be a more appropriate response, and that included taking in the site to the north. That's, for those of you familiar, is known as 11 to 17 Hampton Street. That's where there's that division in levels on Walker Street, if you can visualise it, to take in those smaller properties there. So even though that proposal was rejected, that then led to a new planning proposal being lodged with council in March 2019. So this proposal took in the sites as previous, 173 to 179 Walker Street, and then also the sites along Hampton, which you can see in your diagram there. And it sought to increase the height by around between 62 to 72 metres. So the figures you see on that diagram are the stories in the black circles of the different building elements. So this was their concept or massing diagram, and the RLs is a reduced level. That's a more technical way of measuring height that they described it as. And that was to establish a floor space ratio of the whole site. That's the combined areas of just over 6 to 1. So just again, a quick sequence here of timing. Council staff in this instance recommended refusal again. The panel agreed with that. That's the local planning panel for advice. Went back to council in August 2019, who subsequently followed that recommendation and rejected the PP planning proposal. Rezoning review lodged and was heard by the panel in February 2020. And then there was a gateway determination issued several months later. In this instance, council wasn't the PPA, Principal Planning Authority. It was exhibited by the Department of Planning, which to be blunt, wasn't done particularly well and was very difficult to sort of navigate with all the documentation and the amendments that occurred through the process. Of note in this one, I don't mean to jump around, but what this one highlights the fact that council, if we get to where we're up to now, the exhibition point in October, November, that was the point when council was very close to, and in fact, I think it was November when the council finalised the civic precinct planning study. So that was a sort of an area-based study which examined a number of sites and their potential for accommodating some growth. And that study wasn't a no development by any means. It was identifying up to 20 stories on a portion of this site. And frustratingly, rather than that strategic document endorsed by council being the basis for it, the panel didn't agree with that position and went ahead and proceeded to support the proposal at 29 stories. There was a lot of submissions for this one. I'm going to say it was over 100 from recollection. And so because of that, the Sydney North Planning Panel post-exhibition held a public hearing. So myself and some others, so quite a number of residents and one of the councillors addressed that panel in the public setting, and they heard everyone out. And unfortunately, however, they proceeded to make the plan as exhibited. So that occurred in August 2021. So this diagram is just trying to illustrate that there's been some refinement along the way. This was a slightly different diagram to what I showed previously, and this was done in response to the panel's recommendation. So you can see there that this is a proponent scheme. You've got a massing diagram on the left with that 29-story element and the lower elements, and then a rendered image on the right of screen. So again, just to enliven this, excuse me, I feel like I'm about to sneeze, so apologies. This was the PP, March 2019, to recap. Local planning panel not supporting, council not supporting, the rezoning review lodged. That panel recommended progression of that proposal. And then the gateway determination issued, public exhibition. Again, just to illustrate here, the PPA role that was run by the planning panel's secretariat or department staff. So that exhibition occurred, and then ultimately led to an amendment to the LEP. So that has now led to a development application being lodged with North Sydney Council. So because of the value of the works, the council has a role where we do the detailed assessment of the scheme, or my colleagues in the assessment team, against the LEP and any relevant controls, and then it would have gone to a panel for determination as an actual DA because of the value of the works. However, in this instance, the applicant has lodged an appeal directly with the Land and Environment Court, so we're now in the DA process. And you can see that diagram is from the applicant's package there. The massing and build form there is quite different in scale and impact. A lot of residents understandably very concerned with the view loss and scale of that scheme that's there before you. So this one now, just again for timelines, lodged originally, this site, so the two sites together, Hampton and Walker Street, lodged in March 2019. The DA lodged only in July, and let's say theoretically, if they get some kind of approval from the court in the new year, you're looking at around a 4-year time frame there for someone to potentially have a development application approved on that site. So look, that's just two examples that I hope have sort of enlivened or illustrated that process. So we've talked about the time frame that they've taken. We've talked about the steps that the different decision points are, and what kind of information comes in with those. So sometimes, understandably, as Marcella said, they are quite detailed diagrams that come in that the community sort of looks at to try, and that's the applicant's proof of concept or their sort of realisation of those controls that are being sought. So I hope that's helped in explaining that. I'm just going to bring up here a table, which myself, I don't think we're going to run through each line there, but you can see there, this is a number of sites, planning proposals at different stages. You can see the status of those and where they're up to, and some have been exhibited, some are close to exhibition, and you can see quite a number there that have been rejected by council. and then their status. So there's several there that have were depending on how you determine success. So take 20 Berry Street, for example, there, the fourth one down. That applicant's rezoning review was unsuccessful, so council had its way in that one. The next one down, 253 to 267, the rezoning review was successful. That means by the applicant. So just so we're clear on the jargon there. So there's been several there where unfortunately the panel has not aligned with council's decision on that. So I'll now jump back to Marcelo, who's going to give a little bit of a summary, and then hopefully we can work through some of the questions that have come in. And then if there's any other questions, we can hopefully have time to field those. So
thanks, Neil.
do you want to jump to?
Okay, so look, this is the last slide. In summary, just the main points, and there's lots of questions and issues that sort of go off in different directions as well that are worth discussing. But in summary, a planning proposal is an application to change the LEP control. We've said that a few times. The council relies, as Neil has pointed out, on endorsed planning studies, which are consistent with state government directions through the regional plan, the district plan, and then our local strategic planning statement, LSPS, to provide the basis for changes to LEP controls. That way we avoid ad hoc changes, speculative changes that no one's quite expecting. I think there's some comments there about a comment about whether growth is good or bad. Growth, unfortunately, for some in Sydney, growth is a fact of life, and in a highly connected place like North Sydney, it will continue to be a part of life, particularly in the context of investment in public transport through the metro. The planning proposal process is complicated, as we've kind of illustrated, I think, this evening. But the two important points that we'd like to get across is that the council requires Department of Planning approval to get changes across the line. We don't do it on a unilateral basis. We rely on the Department of Planning for its approval. There's one instance in the recent past where a council initiated planning proposal on Holt Avenue for some heritage items has been knocked back by the Department of Planning. And the second point out of the process as well is that applicants have review rights, and they're exercising those review rights more and more in recent times, and successfully so in many cases. So the rules around about 15 or so years ago were quite different. There were no appeal rights, there were no rezoning review opportunities, and the council's decision was the final decision, and the only party that could intervene otherwise was the Minister for Planning. So that's the planning proposal description in a nutshell. We might just go to some of the questions and issues that have been raised since we last paused. And I think the first one is, sorry, I'm just scrolling through. John just asked a question, what proportion of, oh, sorry, we've gone past that. Yeah, just to be clear, 5 council rejected PPs went to Sydney North, 4 endorsed and 1 rejected. That's correct. So of the 5 refusals that have gone up most recently, and I'm talking about the last probably 9 months or so, of the 5 refusals, 4 have been overturned by the Sydney North Planning Panel. Only 1, and that was at 20 Berry Street, did the panel agree with the council's refusal. Barbara has asked who appoints the Sydney North Planning Panel, members, planning experts. The Sydney North Panel is, so there's 5 people sitting around the table. The quorum is 3. Of the 5 parties, 3 are state appointed, 2 are local government appointed. I mean, the appointments are done through the secretariat of the panels, but council nominates a minority of those panelists, and they're appointed. I'm not sure if it's every 3 years or 4 years, but there is a term that they serve.
So they tend, just on that part of that, the planning experts, they tend to have a variety of backgrounds. Some have more of a legal background, others are some have an architectural background. others are planners from various fields within the planning profession.
There's a link there regarding climate action, and yep, we note that. Peter talks about we're not going to be political in this forum, so the local member. I think that's a statement more than a question. I noticed that the local planning panel and the City North planning panel, when evaluating a planning proposal or a DA, make statements that a proposal either has or doesn't have site-specific or strategic merit. I don't usually see any justification or explanation in the publicly available reports. What do they mean when they use these terms? Do the panels provide any details? Look, I must say that the City North Planning Panel's evaluation report, at least the publicly available ones, it's a fairly minimalist approach to reporting, and there isn't a long and verbose explanation as to why things are supported or not. There's a fairly clipped version. I'm not sure if it is a version, but that's what we see. So there isn't a huge amount to digest normally.
Just on that, if that can help, in the Department of Planning's LEP amendment guidelines, there is some more specific commentary on what matters are that you would normally consider in strategic merit and site-specific. So there's instances where, for example, a site might have been deemed to have strategic merit by virtue, say, of its proximity to the metro or the like, but then they say it doesn't have site-specific merit because what they were seeking might have been excessive or give rise to a planning outcome that they didn't deem acceptable. But Marcelo is right, that panel position on that is fairly lean. And in fact, just technically, so everyone's clear, that panel makes a recommendation to the minister, the minister's delegate. I'm not aware of them ever not having followed that, but that panel, it's called a decision, but they don't actually issue the gateway determination. The Department of Planning still has to do that. So, but no, I can perhaps maybe send you a link to that document that talks a bit more about it. So in our assessment report, so that's the council officers one, we do go to some considerable detail in terms of what we, in terms of assessing a proposal against the key strategic studies or matters for consideration. So I hope that's helped answer that.
The next question there, John, is, I think this is more of a statement than a question, I think. Given that developers so frequently override planning controls with gateway determinations and local planning panel session and local planning panel sessions can be close to the public, there seems to be no certainty in having any controls at all. So many of these approved proposals have just doubled or even tripled planning heights. Look, I think there's probably a little bit more nuance than that. I can certainly understand that perspective. I mean, we've got the St Leonard's and Crow's Nest 2036 plan, which has dramatically increased heights along that corridor. We do try to recognise that that there are certainly opportunities for increasing development capacity, and that's why and the planning system seems to be built on those opportunities at the moment. But that's why we put so much emphasis on our own planning studies to try and manage and guide. And it's not everyone's cup of tea, we acknowledge that, but the alternative, as we saw with the Hampton Street, Walker Street example, is the market simply dictates what goes on the basis of proximity to a metro station, access to services and shops and other things to substantiate an argument about increased height and increased capacity to accommodate people. So we do still store a lot of emphasis on our own planning controls. Sorry, our own planning studies to guide that change rather than allowing it to happen on an ad hoc basis.
So yeah, that's okay. And just on that, we have made direct requests to the department staff and the panel to say, look, we've had requests from members of the public to come and give their concerns. They're happy to even to observe. However, unfortunately, and this is the same across Sydney, they don't run those panels as an open session. So from a philosophical point of view, I find that disappointing, that transparency of decision making, even if the outcome's not what someone wants, I think is only fair. But we have and will continue to make those representations. The next one I'll answer there in relation to 12 to 14 Waters Road. That was a planning proposal not supported by council some months back, and then subsequently was received a positive recommendation from the panel. In this instance, I think there'll be a matter going to the next council meeting on the 14th of November, which will deal with that. So I'll wait until that agenda is finalised, but I can say the opponent there is honouring their offer there, and that will be a decision for council at its next meeting on the 14th.
So Sarah asked, when a planning proposal has not been supported by council, in general, how does the council communicate their position to the City North Planning Panel? Does the council meet with the panel or have the opportunity to present council's position to the panel? Or is it just a report that's made available to the panel? So the answer is both. As soon as a rezoning review is lodged, we're advised of that. The council is given an opportunity of putting its case forward, bearing in mind that a very, very substantial report is already on the public record. But we summarise that report in what is typically a 6 or 7 page letter to the panel. We reinforce that with appearance. It's normally Neil and I appearing in front of the panel, arguing against a plethora of consultants and on the applicant side often. So we do make representations face to face or on these sorts of platforms more so these days. And generally speaking, that forum goes for about an hour, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more.
Yeah, so just so everyone's aware, we've also been finding, because we're in this still in this electronic meeting forum, we've prepared visual presentations with images, sections, overshadowing diagrams to help support that. So at least if the panel is as informed as it possibly can be, at least from our perspective. So it's professional and courteous, but we certainly make strong representations in terms of particularly when the applicant has put their case, and we'll come back with what council's position is as clearly and articulately as we can.
So, folks, I'm just going through the list of questions and queries that were lodged prior to tonight. I think we've addressed all of them. Understanding the gateway process, explain the role of different decision-making bodies of council, the local planning panel, the Land and Environment Court, clarification about the Land and Environment Court, just general awareness of the process. Don't have any specific questions. There was one here. It simply says heritage and proposal. So I'm not quite sure what that was getting at. So I'm not sure, Paul, if you're on the line, if you want to clarify that. The other one, which is not really the purpose of tonight, but there was why does council approve flats without parking? In the real world, people have at least one car, etc. There is some of you may be aware, a development control plan amendment, a draft amendment that's on public exhibition at the moment. And the point of that is indeed to reduce private car parking in new development in areas, only in those areas that we have identified as high accessibility areas that are generally supported by the new metros arriving at Crows and Victoria Cross. And what we have found in our research is that within those areas, very significant proportion, not of people, but households, don't have a car. And in North Sydney, it's as high as almost a third of households already not owning a car. So we're trying to build on that momentum. Obviously, the more car parking you provide, that's a great barometer of car use. And in Sydney, increasingly so, in these areas of high levels of accessibility, greater investment in wider roads, bigger roads, greater capacity intersections, not only costs money that's could be elsewhere spent, but it also has an absolutely fundamental city shaping effect. Anyway, but perhaps for another time, happy to talk about that further. There's a lot to unpack, no doubt. I think there was a couple more questions there, Neil, is that right?
Probably a bit of comments there just on transparency and thank you and farewell. So look, I think we're almost on 7, so we've done it a little bit faster than we thought. We hope that's been useful and informative. There was one question around this presentation. Look, I think the recording is going to be put on there. If the actual document is, presentation document is easier for people to digest as a PDF, something we can certainly post that as well. So if there's no other burning issues, yeah, I think we'll say good evening and thank you everyone for your interest, and hopefully this information helps you with your precinct meetings and some of your neighbours and colleagues in understanding what is an incredibly complicated process. I've heard New South Wales planning be described as the most complicated in the world. I've only worked in Sydney and in London for a short stint, but I can certainly say I agree with it. We find it challenging as well. So is there anything else in wrapping up?
Oh, just thank you everyone for turning up, maybe giving up some of your dinner time. And we'll obviously post this online, but if you have any other questions, please feel free to post them on the Your Say website. Reach out to myself or Neil. Alternatively, happy to take your call or your email whenever it's convenient.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Good evening.